Arthur Schopenhauer was one of history's deepest thinkers, but for most of his life, lecture halls remained empty, while his rival Hegel packed them full. Some say society rejected him because he was too negative. Others claim he was just ahead of his time. So what's the real truth about why society pushes away its deepest thinkers? Watch to find out. Picture this: Frankfurt, 1820. A man sits alone in his apartment, talking to his poodle, while next door, hundreds of students crowd into a lecture hall. That lonely man was Arthur Schopenhauer, and he would later be called one of the most influential philosophers ever. But at the time, he couldn't get anyone to listen to him. His rival Hegel was teaching just blocks away, and students couldn't get enough of it. Why? Because Hegel told people what they wanted to hear, that history was moving towards something better, that humans were becoming more perfect. Schopenhauer? He said life was mostly suffering, and we're all just walking in circles. But here's where it gets interesting. While Hegel was celebrated, Schopenhauer's own mother, Johanna, wouldn't even let him visit her salon. She was a famous writer who hosted the biggest names in German culture, but she told Arthur his dark views would drive away all my guests. Imagine that, being so honest about life that your own mother bans you from her house. She even wrote him a letter saying, "Your complaints about the stupid world and human misery give me bad digestion." The year was 1819, and it wasn't just his mother. The entire intellectual establishment of Germany had turned its back on him. But what really made society so uncomfortable wasn't just his ideas, it was how he delivered them. While other philosophers wrote in complex, hard-to-understand language that made simple ideas sound deep, Schopenhauer did the opposite. He took deep ideas and made them crystal clear. He once said, "If I were to measure the worth of my books according to the number of people who've read them, I would have been better off becoming a shoemaker." In his first semester as a lecturer at the University of Berlin, only 5 students signed up. By the second semester, it was down to 0. Meanwhile, Hegel's classes were so full that students had to sit in the hallways. That's why this story matters, because it shows us something about how society treats its most honest thinkers, the ones who don't just point out what's wrong, but do it in a way that's impossible to ignore. But this is just the beginning of the story, and you won't believe what happened next. People often imagine philosophers as old men who spent their whole lives in libraries, but Schopenhauer's path was different. His father was a wealthy merchant who gave him a choice: become a businessman or travel Europe first. Young Arthur chose travel, and it changed everything. At 17, he watched public executions in France, saw mental asylums in England, and witnessed extreme poverty in Italy. These weren't just tourist stops, they shaped his entire view of life. But here's the weird part. While other young men his age were partying across Europe, Schopenhauer was writing down everything he saw in detailed notebooks. He filled pages about beggars on the streets of Naples, describing how their faces looked when they slept. He wrote about prisoners he visited, noting how some seemed happier than wealthy merchants. This wasn't normal behavior for a teenager from a rich family. When his father died by suicide in 1805, something snapped in Arthur. He gave up the family business and dove into philosophy against his mother's wish. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. His mother, Johanna, had just become a famous novelist. She moved to Weimar, started hanging out with Germany's biggest cultural celebrities, and told Arthur he was too depressing to visit. Imagine becoming one of history's greatest minds while your mom is partying with poets and telling everyone her son is a failure. But instead of changing his message to make people like him, Schopenhauer doubled down. He wrote his masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation, at age 30. He was so confident in it that he told his publisher, "My book is a new philosophical system, but don't worry, it's actually readable." That last part was a dig at other philosophers who wrote in complicated language on purpose. He believed philosophy should be written as clearly as a letter to a friend. The book sold exactly 234 copies in its first year. His publisher ended up using most copies as paper scraps. But here's the crazy part. In those 234 copies, Schopenhauer explained ideas that would later influence Einstein's theory of relativity, Freud's understanding of the unconscious mind, and even modern theories about human motivation. He was literally centuries ahead of his time, but because he refused to make his ideas sound fancy and complicated, the academic world treated him like a joke. Want to know the most ironic part? The same ideas that got him rejected would later make him famous, but only after he spent 25 years eating alone at the same restaurant in Frankfurt, talking to his poodle, and writing notes about how stupid everyone was for not understanding him. But that's where our next chapter begins. Society's reaction to Schopenhauer wasn't just rejection, it was almost comical. Every day at exactly 12 o'clock, he would sit at the same table at the Hotel Englischer Hof in Frankfurt. For 2 hours, he would place a gold coin on the table. If he finished his meal without talking about philosophy, he would give the coin to the poor. If he got into a philosophical discussion, he would keep it. After 25 years of this routine, he never once gave away the coin. But here's where things get wild. While the academic world ignored him, Schopenhauer was building what we'd now call a cult following. Artists, writers, and musicians started sneaking his books home. Richard Wagner, the famous composer, was so obsessed with Schopenhauer's ideas that he sent him a gold-bound copy of his Ring Cycle. Schopenhauer's response? He didn't even open it. He was too busy writing angry notes about how noisy the street musicians were outside his window. His daily life became a kind of performance art of rejection. He named his poodles Atma, meaning world soul, and would walk them every day at the same time, regardless of weather. Local kids would mock him, calling him Der Spinner, the weirdo. His response, he wrote in his notebook, "Everyone takes the limits of their own vision for the limits of the world." That line would later become one of his most famous quotes. But the real punchline of society's rejection came in 1840. A Norwegian group awarded him a prize for his essay on the freedom of the will. When they asked him where they should send the money, he replied, "To Frankfurt. I'm the only Schopenhauer here. And sadly, I'll probably still be here when your letter arrives." He was right. He had become such a fixture of rejection that locals used him as a landmark. Turn left at the angry philosopher's house. The breaking point came when another philosopher, Friedrich Benecke, tried to review his work positive. The university blocked the review, claiming it would confuse young minds. Schopenhauer's response was pure Schopenhauer. He published a paper titled On University Philosophy, where he compared professional philosophers to dogs who marked their territory. He wrote, "Truth can wait, for she lives a long life." What makes this story so fascinating is how future events proved him right. By 1860, just before his death, young philosophers started showing up at his door. One of them, Julius Frauenstadt, arrived expecting a bitter old man. Instead, he found Schopenhauer laughing at his own jokes, surrounded by books, and still ranting about how society prefers comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But the real vindication was still to come. The greatest joke in philosophy happened after Schopenhauer's death. Suddenly, everyone claimed they'd understood him all along. The same universities that rejected him started teaching entire courses about his work. But the real impact of his ideas went way beyond philosophy classroom. Sigmund Freud kept Schopenhauer's books by his bed and later admitted he had really figured out the unconscious mind before I was even born. That's right. The father of psychoanalysis basically discovered that Schopenhauer had beaten his biggest ideas by 70 years. Freud even joked that reading Schopenhauer made him feel like a kid who built a sandcastle, only to discover someone had already built an entire palace in the same spot. But here's the mind-blowing part. Schopenhauer's influence kept popping up in the weirdest places. Einstein had a copy of The World as Will and Representation in his library and referenced it when explaining relativity. Carl Jung built his theory of collective unconscious on Schopenhauer's ideas. Even Charles Darwin wrote in his notebook that Schopenhauer's views on human nature helped shape his understanding of evolution. Modern tech giants accidentally proved Schopenhauer right too. In 2018, a study showed that negative news spread 6 times faster on social media than positive news. Schopenhauer had written in 1818, "We feel pain but not painless. We feel worry but not security. Fear but not safety." Social media companies discovered this the expensive way, by building algorithms that basically run on the same principle Schopenhauer described 200 years ago. In 2022, when Mark Zuckerberg announced Meta's losses of $23 billion, he quoted a line that, although he probably didn't know it, came straight from Schopenhauer. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. The final twist? The same qualities that made society reject Schopenhauer. His clarity, his refusal to sugarcoat things, his insistence on pointing out uncomfortable truths are exactly what made him outlast his critics. Today, while Hegel's books gather dust in university libraries, Schopenhauer's quotes show up everywhere, from self-help books to Silicon Valley boardroom. Maybe that's the real lesson. Society doesn't hate deep thinkers. It hates being forced to look in the mirror. Schopenhauer didn't just think deeply, he made it impossible for others to look away from what he saw. As he wrote in his last notebook, "Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see." It just might take society a couple centuries to catch up to what that genius saw.